So first of all, I think the first question goes to Jane. He says, Jane, I'm impressed with the thinking that has gone into the governance aspect of working towards zero carbon. Would I be similarly impressed with the development of policy, strategy, and the detailed planning for delivering net zero?
I'm probably not, but that's because I haven't seen any detailed planning anywhere in the context of net zero. And I know that one of the key issues, particularly for a small government such as the government in Wales, I mean, I know when I was minister, I held the portfolio that was covered by 7 ministers in the UK government, for example, with a 20th of the number of officials helping me. So I think one of the key challenges is that point that has been made a number of times about collaboration. And I think what is becoming really effective, and I hope that you would very much welcome this, is the collaboration between the NGOs in Wales, the expertise in Wales that sits outside government and with government on these really difficult issues around energy, around buildings, around environment, for example. And although there's a general election in Wales going on at the moment, during this period of time, I've been working with people across about 40 NGOs and experienced individuals in looking at what a national nature service might look like that actually operated on the similar principles to the NHS and engaged opportunities in terms of training individuals from early childhood through into adults. And I think that it's what the Act has done is given that permission to think differently, and therefore people can with confidence develop ideas and take them to the public sector, take them to government. And we've had something similar in the context of procurement. So huge steps have been taken on procurement. And I know that procurement's been an incredibly difficult issue over 20 years. You know, the rhetoric has been that it's going to be sustainable, it's going to work for small companies, the tests in terms of entry are not going to be too high, and they always have been. But now we have, and this is a partnership between the Future Generations Office and Cardiff University, for example. Now we have a new procurement mechanism that will actually drive the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act into all the private sector that works with the public sector. So I think that's what I think you will be impressed with. And Wales doesn't get on the national news. You know, Wales actually has the best vaccine rates and the lowest number of COVID cases, but you'll never hear about that in England. So you won't hear about this other stuff either. But it is worth just tracking and seeing what is happening in this area.
Thank you, Jane. And the looking at what Wales is doing on retrofit, certainly we have a lot to learn from Wales. They're so far ahead because of the framework of the Wellbeing Act. It is quite phenomenal. They're so much further down the road. And yes, David Clemson, just like Scotland, we have a lot to learn. I'm going to pass a question now to Jennifer. It's a question for Jennifer from Sue James. Absolutely agree that we need the data to have the data up to date, etc. But is there a cost, and how would we pay for it?
So really good question. So thank you. I think the first part of the question was, does data need to be up to date? I think, you know, timeliness of data is all a relative thing. So if you're trying to phase the traffic lights in a town to keep traffic moving and minimize air pollution, you need data sort of, you know, a very high frequency, many data points a second. If you're interested in something like the response rate or the degradation of a bridge, for example, you need data fairly frequently, but you certainly don't need it second by second. You might only need data points that, you know, are captured for 24 hours every couple of months or something like that, or depending on the problem, up-to-dateness is a relative thing. And when we're looking at population statistics, obviously they move even more slowly. And all of these things are relevant, obviously. In terms of cost of data, we've actually got a huge amount of data already. What we don't do is manage it well. So in the built environment industry, and I'm sure Teo and Zarna would and Mike would agree with this, we measure so much stuff. We monitor so many things, and then we typically look at the data once, if that, and then either throw it away, which is simple enough, or worse yet, archive it somewhere we can never get it back from. So we can't learn from trends in the data. It's costing us carbon to store it, whether it's in a filing cabinet in a room or whether it's online, and yet it's useless. So we really need to think about what is the data that we need to answer what kinds of questions. How do we manage it? What data do we need to keep, and what data do we throw away? So, for example, we're monitoring a bridge, a railway bridge. We're only actually interested in the data when a train is going over it. 1 minute in every 10, say, so we can throw away 9 minutes of data straight there. We only need to keep at best 10% of that data, and probably not that much. So there is a cost. I think the bigger cost, though, is not having the data, particularly when you start to think about the climate crisis. If we carry on sailing into the climate crisis with our eyes shut and our fingers in our ears, we can't improve the situation. So I think it's not so much about the cost of data, it's the cost of not having the data. And there was a really interesting piece of work done by Howe's England recently, where they got a consultancy to assess the value of the data about their assets. And I can't remember the exact number, but it was something like either 30 or 50%. So the data was worth a third or half as much as the physical assets. And suddenly Howe's England woke up and thought, crumbs, we better do something useful with this, because if we lose it, we're going to have to spend a huge amount of money to get it back.
Thank you very much. And going to the panel in general, I don't know who wants to go for this question. Whilst
I think Kat's got her hand up for the last one, maybe, Pippa. I don't know if
I do. Sorry, I was just going to add to Jennifer's point, actually, because it really.
Oh, sorry, Kat, I missed that. Sorry.
That's all right. No worries. It just really reminds me about how the importance of service design for data as well, and seeing data as a service. And it just, when Jennifer was speaking, it really reminded me of this project, which is slightly different. But I was working a while ago with a company called Neuron, which create real-time data, which they put into sewers to see whether there are breaks or kind of maintenance, because usually you can only understand that if you put your ear next to the manhole, and only certain people are expert in that. So we need to get better. But what was that? They have this amazing technology, real-time data, so much data, no one knew what to do with it. And none of the water companies wanted to use it because they just didn't know how to kind of access all of that data. So we did a piece of work where we worked with the water companies, understood the different audiences. So there were people at the call center who only needed the data to tell them an alert, whether to send someone out or not. And then there were the kind of the planning department who wanted to look at all the data and manipulate it to create their plans. And actually understanding different types of user needs for the different data helps you then present it in an accessible way where people can then make decisions about it, and it doesn't just get used once and then put to one side.
That sounds eminently sensible. And again, we see design, service design being at the core of it, and how people interface with things being very, very critical. I can feel a conversation coming on after this with several of our panelists and possibly some of our audience, and certainly the organisations who have a vested interest in getting this to happen. I'm going to move on to another question, and I think this, I'm going to throw it to the open room. It's from David John Pitts. Whilst there's been a drive by the councils and large businesses to be able to adapt their practices to net zero, how can small businesses, limited companies involved in the built environment be able to compete and understand the effect that they have? Many don't have the same flexibility or understanding as large companies in terms of being able to adapt their practice. How do we bring them along on this net zero journey? Who'd like to answer?
I'm happy to have a quick first stab and say something very specific about the carbon code that we've been developing that I mentioned in passing in my talk. Part of the carbon code there is very much about, you know, clients and the bigger companies making sure that they share best practice and lessons learned and help bring their supply chain on, because we recognise that this is an issue. And one of the things that NACF have been doing, because they work with contractors of all sizes and scales, is looking at how can they create, for example, metrics for their KPIs, which reward, you know, the big companies for stretching themselves and going further, but reward the smaller companies who perhaps are approaching this for the first time for the effort that they're putting in. And I think my key thing is we shouldn't be trying to compete, we should be trying to collaborate for this, because the climate crisis is too important for competition. Yes. If you're a big company that knows how to do this, figure out how you can work with your supply chain to help them to do it.
Jane. Oh, Terry, may I get to you next?
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, I would agree with what Jennifer said. There's two examples I'd like to perhaps give. One is working with the Design Council and the design in the public sector. There's some lovely examples of how councils are looking at the contracts and looking at how they can bring in their stakeholders and what sort of elements they need to change in order to bring their stakeholders along with them. And then another thing which I think is so important and that is often overlooked. I do work with many organisations, big and small. And what happens is most organisations do have a desire to co-design and work with large and small organisations. But the thing that's often overlooked is the equity about that and the contracts that they're using to actually attract particularly those smaller organisations. So even though the aim is there to work with these smaller organisations, the contracts are not fit for purpose. So my ask is that the larger companies, and there is work with larger companies going on there. I was in a meeting this afternoon and there was some fantastic work where a larger company had realised that actually they need to look at those contracts and to see how they can make them more user-friendly and equitable for those smaller companies. So it is happening, but we need a lot more of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Jane.
Yeah, I mean, can I very strongly echo what Teo has said, because I think the issue around collaboration is really tricky, and it's really tricky because it's about power structures, and it's tricky because it's co-design often ends up with a design that you're asking somebody else to support, you know, for example. So actually it's how we deliver on kind of collaborative approaches. And I think one of the things that we have definitely seen happen as a result of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is almost for the first time in my political life is seeing people being prepared to reach out because they know they can't do it themselves. So I think that is kind of like, you know, it's not at the heart of delivering of the goals, but that whole notion about the way that we work. So if you are going to be preventative and think long term and be collaborative and involve people about whom decisions are being made, it is actually a very different approach to, for example, a traditional government consultation, which people sometimes rightly suggest that government has already made up its mind before it goes out with a consultation. So if these are going to be real, but still delivered in reasonable timeframes, it's about new ways of working. And it just struck me that another thing that I've seen recently as a result of the Act has been many more apprenticeships at all levels. I mean, what I did before today was I spoke at an apprenticeship academy in a public sector organisation, and many of our public sector organisations are setting up such academies and taking apprenticeships on at all levels, including degree apprenticeships, which they've never done before. So I think there's some real opportunities to link this as well to the skills gap. There have been questions and comments about skills. So what can we do in existing systems to expand skills opportunities, working collaboratively and using the strengths of the collaborating partners? And they might be very different strengths. And I know that in the context of my own university, using the clout of a major builder company in terms of getting apprenticeships, but then using the School of Built Environment in terms of framing very different kinds of outcomes for those apprenticeships, in terms of what those young people are learning for the future. So I just think it's that there's a sort of an imaginative redesign around this territory, working with the art of the possible. My own fundamental premise has been, don't let people say no to you and go round a corner to get your way. But that is the way, and you'll all be doing that anyway. But in a sense, make it part of the planning.
So Jane has just touched on the very important question that was raised: are skills more important than data? Does anybody have anything else to add to that? Apart from Andy, I think a little flag wave for LSBU, because we're working on both apprenticeships and skills. And we're also talking about a climate emergency event around collaboration, about really thinking about what collaboration looks like and going into that subject very deeply. Anybody else want to talk about skills? And Mike, I see a raised hand.
I think one without the other has no effect, really. I mean, if you, as we talked about, pure data on its own, might have no meaning whatsoever anyway. The vast majority of things need acting on by people with skills. So I really don't think you can separate the two, or put one as more important. Anybody who's skilled with the right data in the right format in their hands will be empowered. So I think the two are kind of inseparable, really.
Yeah. Anybody on skills?
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth noting that within this arena, if you think of the challenges that we have facing us in order to get net zero by 2050, never mind 2030, you have to consider, do we have those relevant skills now? And the answer is probably no. So skills is incredibly important. And just I think it's really important, coming back to the last conversation, it's really important to recognise that it's not just about, hey, let's get the small guys in or the independents in. It's about recognising that they really bring something to the table, a really different way of thinking and coming up with really good solutions. So it's not just about, hey, let's bring in somebody smaller. They really give value. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Andy, I'm going to let Andy speak. We let him occasionally.
Just a quick one, because the skills is a really key thing as far as I'm concerned. I think it's important to remember that skills are learnt over many years, and many of the skills that we have out there are incredibly valuable. They take ages to learn. What the sort of thing that Mike is doing is bringing them together and giving them to people who understand how to do something but don't yet know they need to, or what little tweak they need to make to their skills to make it happen. So I think existing skills it's really important we carry on with our existing skills, particularly in the built environment. I mean, it's a wonderful place to learn, shall we put it that way? Anyway, that's all.
And Kat, you have a comment there too.
Yeah, I suppose it just speaks to the fact that we're all thinking systemically, and to Taya's point about expanding the brief. So post-COVID, there's going to be so much emphasis on skills as really important for social outcomes, and we need new skills in order to meet our planetary goals and visions. So those two things, one design of really, really good skills programs, which allow people to act in a way that is restorative, then can meet both of those needs. We're doing a piece of work with the GLA at the moment called Designing London's Recovery. And they've set out a series of missions. And we've got a call out at the moment, I'll put it in the chat, but one's around good work, and one's around thriving communities, and one's around green high streets. And I just want to mash them all together, because actually you could imagine some really beautiful designs that actually just hit all three things.
Yes.
So that will be my mission.
Yes. So yes, again, the ability to have a vision and also to bring design in is quite key. I'm going to ask a question here of Alex and maybe Zarna, who haven't spoken. Alex, on this one, I'm going to ask Elżbieta Caletta says, my impression is that only those in the communities who are already active, have an interest in climate change, tend to participate in any initiatives. What action is required, for example, for someone like Cornwall Council, to make sure that those in your community who are passive become engaged? Do you have any particular thoughts on that?
It's a very difficult question. I think in Cornwall we're somewhat lucky in that the environment underpins our economy in a very obvious way. There's a very strong connection in a lot of communities in Cornwall to the environment, to the landscape around them. As I said, because it underpins their economy through things like tourism or fishing or mining and these huge industries down here. But there are people who, yes, and there are communities who are disengaged from this entire process quite badly, and we've put a lot of effort into attempting to communicate with them, or at least attempting to build services and build policies which sort of set by default the actions that people can take. We recognize the boundaries of our power as well, and that there is only a limited amount of resource we can really expend, and there will always be holdouts. But the better we can design our policies and services so that the way people interact with them automatically is the better way, or so to speak, the better it is. I guess, for example, we've always had quite behind the times waste and recycling down in Cornwall. We've not got much infrastructure, but we've recently retendered our contract and we've redesigned our service to try and make it easier for people, but without going down a route of, I don't know how much people know about recycling, but there are two basic systems. One is commingled, which is where everyone puts all their recycling in one bin, and then the source separated. And we've always had source separated down here, and we don't intend to lose that because it produces the best quality recyclate, and it has the overall the best impact on climate in the models that we run and in the research that we know is out there. But trying to redesign the service so that people can easily use it and make it the default, I guess, like making climate change issues the norm, in the same way that we've sort of normalized the fact that your black bin bag gets collected every week. No one really thinks about that, but you know, 50 years ago, you might as well have tipped it on the landscape. We didn't have any laws about that, but it's just the normal thing that people do. So attempting to streamline society into those things which we think are the best ways to do this, with as much evidence as we can to combat, say, climate change or environmental degradation, is the only way that we really know how to go about it.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that I think we deal with the clients, some of them who are super literate about all the net carbon, embodied carbon and all of that, whereas some clients haven't got a clue. So I think the key is to make sure that the information is relayed in a layman's terms so that they can understand. And I think that's a key for engaging non-technical, shall I say, people, or people who are not within the industry, who don't know. So I think what Alex said, you know, having same bin in the same, everything in the same bin or separate bins. I think that's a very simple terms. And if you explain to people in layman's term, it will engage a little bit more interest and a little bit more, direction and collaboration from them. So when we do public consultations, we try and make sure that the information is relayed in such a way that common people can understand, who the technical information is able to be presented in a way that is understood by common people who are not really savvy about the technical terms. I think that brings more engagement from people, and everybody is talking about energy and climate change, and so people understand that, but how we go about it is what needs to be people need to be educated about that in simpler terms, which will then hopefully create more engagement from the community.
Yeah, so we have design, we have normalizing, we have good communications and collaborative processes that people can come together. And so finally, I think we always have more questions than we have time for. We always have much more interest from our audience than we can ever deal with. And I hope that we stimulate conversations. I hope that people go away and think about and do things differently. I hope that they start to network with each other from this event and within their communities and think about some of the issues that have been raised. We've got time for just one more question. And I think we will go to digital twins, because I think digital twins are so important in terms of how we move forward. And we've not been able to do this because the technology, the capacity for the processing has not been around, and now we can. And I've got a question. It's aimed at Mike, but I'm going to throw it across. How common are digital twins, and is there a building type that uses them more often? And Thomas Nowak, who's posted this, he's talked to GE about it. It was conceptually very interesting, but practically not used very often. How common are they? How useful are they? And will we be seeing a proliferation of them? We'll start with Mike. Oh, and Jennifer is hot off the block there. So Jennifer, over to you, and then I'll bring that to Mike. Yes?
I'm going to make a sort of slightly more general comment, which is that I think people perceive that a digital twin is always a 3D representation of the real thing in the real world, and it absolutely doesn't have to be. We did some work with Cambridge where we were looking at a city scale thing, and not only was it not a 3D representation, when we were looking at traffic loadings, we weren't even routing them down the roads. We were just doing arrows from source to destination, because what we needed to understand at that point was how many people are going to be trying to get from A to B, not what route that we're going to go down or anything else. So this was for some future strategic decision making. So a digital twin, what makes it a twin is the connection, the data connection between the digital artifact and the physical artifact. And it can be as realistic as is required in order to help make the decisions that you need to make. And actually, sometimes simple is good. Sometimes you do need the 3D thing, because you might want to inform someone about where they're going in a building in order to make a particular intervention. But sometimes you want a 2D map, and that's perfectly good enough. Sorry, Mike.
I think you said exactly what I was going to say, but much more eloquently. No, absolutely. I think a digital twin is just has to be relevant for whatever purpose it's for. The one I was talking about that we create, it's very similar to what you described, Jennifer. It's a relationship model. So this thing serves this thing, serves this thing, and that consumes that, and that consumes that. But I think important to note that the two, or more than one digital twin can be integrated. So if you do have a 3D, what people classically think of a digital twin, a 3D model of a building, then integrating it with other digital twins of other things that are in the building or outside the building is really key. Like BIM level 3, the idea of using BIM in use, as a live system. We've never done this, but we love the idea of integrating our digital twin into that 3D one. And then there are genuine use cases for that. It's not just for fun, although it would be a bit of fun. But being able to guide someone who doesn't know the building to the problem, to the issue before anyone has noticed that it's an issue, wearing their 3D BIM goggles and so on. all genuinely useful stuff. But yeah, in terms of how prolific they are, not very is my experience at this stage. But I think there should be more, given that, you know, and probably Zarna would have something to say here, but given that, you know, buildings are designed with 3D models, then surely that model exists. So let's bring it into use.
Yeah, I second that, Mike. I mean, we do a lot of 3D. We used to do a lot of 2D, but it's now moved on to 3D. And the model is as good as the input that you put into it. So if it is accurate, obviously it'll take you to the right destination. If it's not accurate, then you might get lost. But in terms of what we call the level 3 BIM model that Mike was mentioning about is the asset tagging. So if, for example, a pump is from a manufacturer, if you put that in, it will tell you what the make, the model, the year, and probably also you can add to it when you need to maintain it. So that way you're making sure that it's energy efficient, it's working the way it should do, and there's no kind of faults in the system which would then lead to a breakdown of service or use of more energy. So it does really help. Unfortunately, not a lot of projects we've been able to get the client to then say, okay, I'm ready to pay for the BIM asset tagging, which then leads on to the question of when can we make efficient use of all that system that is available at the tip of your hands. But it's just because it's not so commonly used, I think it's a little bit more further afield, but we would like to see that being used more and more common, and the FM team would definitely welcome that information at the tip of their hands. So yeah.
So that's really interesting. I think we've got some recurring themes coming through, although that wasn't actually especially intended. Data does seem to be the golden thread. Another golden thread seems to be collaboration, design very, very heavily. These systems all need designing and thinking through. A lot of the problems that we seem to be facing are because they are legacy issues where things have sort of evolved. They haven't been designed, and they haven't been, and we weren't thinking that our carbon use, our wastefulness, across all the systems, water and refuse and materials were so detrimental, and we're now having to rethink a lot of that. So these big things are interconnected. One of the things that we, as I say, Kat has just posted up that we've just been doing some work with CDDB to develop a digital planning curriculum, and as well as all the technical skills, guess what comes up? Collaboration. And so it really brings to bear that we will be looking at collaboration and methods of collaboration and systems as an event in the climate emergency series. What we want to do with this series is bring together the thinking that is a little bit sort of not so obvious, and look at ways that people should be acquiring knowledge and skills and going about their daily business to accelerate the response to the climate emergency. Our next event is the heat part 2. It was so popular last time. Heat was such a big issue. We've got the race to replace domestic gas in a climate emergency. We have a representative Bayes on the panel, Jan Rosenau from before, and Richard Lowe's, two of the leading lights of the climate piece. And we are going to bring some other panelists together and really ramp up the heat pumps, electrification, or as one of them put it, pumpification of our domestic systems. We also will be looking at embodied carbon and life cycles in September. I'll advise everybody about that. But the last thing today is to thank everybody. It takes a long time to put a 10-minute presentation together. It takes longer than if I'd said you've all got half an hour each. It really is quite hard work to précis such a body of knowledge into a short space. It's phenomenal the way you managed to do it, and the team effort from everybody. It's just amazing. We are so grateful to you for being here. We're really grateful for sharing your knowledge, and really grateful for you keeping on doing what you're doing, because this world needs people like you. It really does. Thank you, everybody. And we're 3 minutes over, which is a record for us. Thank you very much indeed. We will be sending out links to all our audience and anyone who signed up. So you will be getting a video and details of as much information as we can share, we will be sending it to you. Thank you all indeed.